Welcome back to Producer's Toolbox. I'm your host, Carole Adrian, and we are addressing this program to all you content creators out there, whether you are filmmakers, writers, artists. This is a place where we endeavor to give you the best leverage and options and avenues for research. Now, today we're going to talk about another round of historical research, and we are in an area about which I personally know very little, which is World War I. I know that it's called the Great War, and that's about it. But I have seen some of the beautiful posters and ephemera that is part of the legacy of that war. But we are going to talk with two people today who are far more experienced researchers in this area than I. We have Sarah Weatherwax, who is the Senior Curator of Graphic Arts from Library Company of Philadelphia, which is one of our country's most prominent repositories of items of American culture from the 17th to the 19th century. And we have John Heckman, also known as the Tattooed Historian, who you've probably seen if you're on YouTube, Twitter, or Twitch. He does amazing interviews, book reviews, introduces us to authors, takes us on tours of historical locations, and these things are right in his wheelhouse. So we're going to find out more about how to do and where to do research if you are working on any project involving American history during World War I. So welcome, guys. Hi, John and Sarah. Thank you for coming back. Sarah, let's start with you. Can you talk to us a little bit about, now here we have better accessibility to materials than we did in previous wars. Can you talk to us a little about that?
Well, certainly by the time of the First World War, photography was everywhere. That was, no longer the issue that it was in the mid-19th century when you were dealing with, very early photography didn't even, create negatives. They were one-of-a-kind images. So, you need to have negatives to have multiple copies of things. So, once that technological barrier is broken, photography is much more widely available. And certainly for World War I, you even had aerial photography. So there was, all types of photography, documenting, what was going on, both in the home front and on the battlefield. And certainly, as you mentioned, the posters that went along with World War I, whether they were posters urging young men to, sign up to be a soldier, whether they were, encouraging people on the home front to, conserve energy or, don't eat meat on Mondays because the boys overseas need, the protein. There were all sorts of, just really, really graphically stunning posters that were created for World War I. And that's actually was a bit of a surprise for me as someone who works at the library company whose collections are very much more associated with, the 18th and 19th century, when we decided or we were interested in doing something to commemorate the 100th anniversary of America entering World War I. It was a little bit of a surprise to find out that the library company has over 300 World War I posters.
Wow.
Because they're not things that would normally be associated with our collection. But we think that we've had most of the posters since World War I. Libraries were a place where these posters were hung up. And, in one case, I think it's the poster that says, "And they thought we couldn't fight." On the back, there's a pencil note that indicates that it was dropped off at the library company by a woman who was part of the Philadelphia committee for, it was the women's committee that was sort of, working on making the home front patriotically support the war effort. And she dropped this off at the library company. And I suspect that's where many of our posters, they simply have been here since, 1917, 1819.
Wow. Now we had motion picture photography at this point in time, right? So there is some actual footage, motion picture footage from this war, which had never been possible before this time. Is that correct?
I would assume so. I'm going to, maybe lob that one over to John, but we don't at the library company, but certainly, the technology was there to have motion pictures.
What do you say, John, about motion picture photography? Was that happening?
Motion films were in their infancy at this time, but they were occurring overseas. We have motion films here in the United States that are documenting some of the later parts of the war. You see it a lot when the men are marching off to war in 1917. You see it in 1918 as well. And it's starting to come up in popularity as far as a medium that is accessible to some. It's still very expensive to operate these things, but they're maneuverable. And the Army is very interested in both still photography and motion picture photography, so much so that they make a branch of the United States Army Signal Corps as basically photography units. And you have both moving pictures and photographs involved in that effort to document the men overseas and to say this is what our war effort looks like, and also to have kind of a lessons learned kind of thing as well. Like, what did the trenches look like when we got there in 1917, late 1917, early 1918? What did it look like in open field combat and things to this extent? So both are being readily used and are usually attached to divisions of the United States Army. And they are right there with the men, especially the photography, still photography is being used heavily on the front line and just behind the front line. You see more of the film photography being used kind of in the rear area of the line because they're maneuverable, but they're not as maneuverable, and you don't need someone up there like cranking away on a film camera trying to get that nice movie image. Many of those are actually, when we see them, like men going over the top and out into the open, and it's on film, a lot of those are staged. But most of what you see in the still photography with men who are getting ready to go, what they say, over the top and out into no man's land or through a wood line or through a woodlot, a lot of those are actual photos, although there were some staged, which is a real terror for a historian who's trying to say, hey, I found this great image of them going through this wood line. It's like, yeah, that was post-war and they staged it. So it can cause a little bit of mayhem for some of us who do research.
Well, as a novice at this particular area of historical research, one thing I noticed from actually what you guys turned me on to and looking, and we're going to come back to these exhibitions, but looking at the posters and the graphic arts, there's a very prominent sense of, I would say, gallows humor that comes with the World War I images that I did not sense. There's a strange humor with the Civil War stuff where pictures of Jefferson Davis in a dress and all kinds of satirical images. But seems much stronger in World War I. I have a picture here on my desk, and I think we have an image of it here. It's an image of a cat flying through the air with claws extended, and it says, "Treat 'em rough, join the tanks." And just like you, Sarah was saying, that image that says, "And they said we couldn't fight." There's that kind of saucy, cheeky,
in your face,
try to beat us down humor that I did not detect in the Civil War materials. But there are, and I actually, Sarah had turned me on to two exhibitions that have wonderful access online. The one is from the Library Company of Philadelphia called Together We Win. And we're going to put up these URLs at the end of this episode so that you can access them from home. And then the other, I hadn't realized that Villanova University has an extensive collection of World War I materials. And is that the one called Remembering? What's it called, Sarah?
Home Before the Leaves Fall.
Home Before the Leaves
And it's
Fall.
where Villanova acted as sort of a catch-all for organizations in the Delaware Valley to, submit material and to write blog posts and to, sort of digitize things from the various collections. And they sort of put it all together at this website, again, for the 100th commemoration of the America entering the war.
Wow. Well, we will put these up. Now, John, I wanted to ask you about a preferred method. Now, you worked from regimental histories. How's your process? Can you share that with us?
Yes, it's in a way, it's kind of like when I used to do Civil War research. I decided to go at the unit level. And it kind of carries over into the First World War because a lot of the veterans, when they come home, they want to tell their story. And each individual division tends to make a divisional history. And you can find them in hardback form. One of my ancestors was actually with the 314th Infantry, which was the Philadelphia boys. And they have a unit history attached in the 79th Division divisional history. So it's a nice thick book, and it has everything that they want to talk about, what they went through. And sometimes there is some bias in there because they don't want to say certain things and they don't want to put a commander down or something. But it allows you to get the overall picture of what an individual division went through. And we sent many divisions overseas. And then you can get down to a lower level as far as to the individual or to the photograph, like we were just talking about, or to the film. And you can connect the two histories together so that you can get a better literal picture of what it was like for these men. But I've always started at the macro level, no matter what period I've studied, to get down and whittle it down to what I needed to focus on. And I think those of us who do historical research, we tend to think in the macro form first. And we're often being told you need to whittle this down and make and get this streamlined a little bit more and a little bit more. Or maybe it's just me, but I always had a problem with that, where I had a big idea and I'm like, I want to write about this. But I kept having people say, you need to kind of cut this down a little bit more. I think that's how we start our research process as well, no matter what time period, but especially for the First World War. You can go to those big divisional histories and then whittle it down to the photograph you're looking at or the personal record of this individual. Maybe your great-great-grandfather or great-great-great-grandfather left a letter and you want to find that out. The behind-the-scenes thing, the divisional records are really great for those kinds of methods of research.
Now, where would we find these books? Are they something that libraries carry, or are they more of a specialty?
They'll definitely be in the specialty section of a library. They will, if they have any of your local library. They'll be in the research room if they have them. If not, you want to go to some of your historical societies. A lot of local historical societies tend to have things about local veterans and what they went through. And sometimes you can find these massive histories. You can find original copies and you can find them in used bookstores sometimes. You can find them in rare bookstores. And in this era, there are some that are actually being digitized by individuals or historical societies to make it even more accessible. So if you know a division that your ancestor fought with, you can look up the division and you'll probably find a divisional history attached to that particular unit.
Now, when we discussed doing Civil War research, and we talked about working with the memoirs of the individual soldier or the facts surrounding their lives. So by the time, I guess, that we get to World War I, the size of these divisions is much larger. We're talking about a larger population and a larger division. Does it whittle down to the memories of the individual as much as the Civil War research does?
It can, if someone is an outstanding soldier, as they would say, and they've really presented themselves in battle in a heroic way, especially if they've won the Medal of Honor, which was not a rare thing in the First World War to earn the Medal of Honor for actions on the front. They tend to be highlighted. However, the divisional records can be somewhat dry, and they don't get down to the personal level as much as we would tend to like sometimes, as far as if you love to research the personal end of things. So they do have that macro feel to it, but it's a great starting point, and it's a fantastic resource to just get your feet wet and try to understand the entire period, because we can look at the art, as Sarah has said, and be connected to it. As you can see behind me, I have like two pieces. I actually have the piece that says, and they said we couldn't fight. It's over on this wall over here. It still impacts how we see it today, and the patriotism of that period. And then when you dive down into these primary sources, you see that some of these guys were drafted and didn't want to be there in the first place. And that leads to further questions. But the divisional histories really guides us in that direction to try to find those good quality stories and understanding something that they went through in a new way.
In the course of my research back in the Civil War, I found many collections of letters from soldiers or personal documents. Are there collections like that from World War I? I know I sound like very ignorant of this history, but let's face it, I am. Sarah, what is there that level of availability of these personal documents?
Well, there certainly is not at the library company, because that's not our area of strength in particular. But again, I suspect so, but I'm going to defer. It sounds to me like John has a lot more experience in doing research in this area than I do, but my gut feeling is yes, there's probably more. But
John has transitioned wars.
yeah.
He used to be a Civil War guy. Now he's switched wars.
But I will say,
very convenient for us.
It's sort of an oddity, though, that at least, what I found when I was working on the World War I, particularly as it related to the library company's history, was that it wasn't considered long enough ago to have the official library company records of what the library was doing during that time sort of didn't seem to exist. I mean, we're very much better at documenting our 18th century history, our 19th century history, but the early 20th century history was just sort of like, I found a few random, letters, from the director to the American Library Association about what are libraries doing to, face this crisis, and, a few things about, whether the building could stay open because was it an essential building, because there was a coal shortage. So, the Philadelphia city government didn't want certain buildings that weren't considered essential to stay open. There was a little bit of that, but for the most part, it was sort of like, that's just not that long ago. And, it's not part of the historical record relating to the archives of the library company. So I don't know if that's typical with what you find, John, that it's just, it's over 100 years now. It should be out there.
It's very true that the World War I era of study is still rich with things that need to be said and need to be written about. It's almost as if we have our Civil War history, and then we have our Second World War history, and everything in between is kind of like, it happened, but it doesn't sell, or it doesn't do something else, whatever the excuse may be. And I think even the way that we went about looking at our centenary of the First World War in 2017, 2018, we acted as if there was nothing going on from 2014 to 2017 overseas, when actually there were some great things going on. We actually celebrated the same way we felt 100 years ago, where it was like, oh, that's over there, we're not worried about it. And then when 2017 happened and it was our time, we're like, here we go, we're involved now. So I think historical memory plays a big factor in that era, and it really doesn't matter the location, or sometimes the historical society or an organization. Sometimes the First World War is glossed over because it was a short period of time for America. It was 18 months, was basically from April of 1917 to November of 1918. And it was a short period of time. It was a short war, although we had some massive engagements at that time. The largest campaign in U.S. Army history is in the First World War. But yet we don't think about it as much. So when you're researching and you're looking at these documents, you may be looking at it for the first time in 20 years since someone has cracked that document open. So I think that's really, really important to remember, is you're on the cutting edge sometimes of what's going on with the historical research. So if you want to get into a period that sometimes gets glossed over, and you might have a gold mine waiting for you at a historical society, it's definitely the First World War era for those in the United States.
Oh, I wondered about that, because with the Civil War, now I get a lot of requests for lecturing from groups known as Civil War roundtables. And there seem to be dozens of them across the country. And I don't even know all of them. But there are so many reenactors. In fact, there are Revolutionary War reenactors. There are a lot of groups associated with it, with people who are amazing specialists, researchers and historians. But do those kind of groups exist for World War I?
They do. There is something called the Western Front Association, and it is located in Europe. It's centralized in Britain and in Europe. They have places that have meetings and have conferences. There's actually an East Coast branch of the Western Front Association here on the East Coast of the United States. So right around the viewing area, there is an East Coast branch. But again, it's a very small community of scholars that are working on these projects. And it really, there are no roundtables, as we would say in the Civil War field or anything like that. There are reenactors. I used to be one, but there is that community as well. But it tends to be a small, tight-knit community. And that also means that the research end of it is still ripe for the taking for certain topics. Europe has done a great job talking about their First World War history, and it's still fresh in many of their minds. Canada is similar. They take a very British route of looking at the First World War, because they go in as soon as the British go in as well, alongside them in the Commonwealth forces. America is kind of an outlier. We not only saw it differently in 1915 and 1916, we saw it differently in 2015 and 2016. And I think that's something that we are starting to tackle now as historians and thinking about historical memory. But if you, as a researcher, want to dive into something new, there's a lot there that we haven't even talked about yet. And I'm not saying don't study the Civil War, or don't study the Revolution or the Great Depression, but there is a really key moment in American history that impacted so much later on that we haven't really embraced it as a historical time period for research and development just yet. But we're on the cusp, where I keep trying to push people.
Now, if correct me if I'm wrong, but no World War I battles were fought on American soil, were they? Is this part of the reason there's a dearth of information or research?
Well, I think that could be the case. We definitely had some German U-boats off of the coast at that time, and we definitely had threats to the United States and our ally to the north, Canada, along the coastlines. But I don't know if that's the real reason, because other than the Aleutians, we didn't really have battles here on United States territory in the Second World War. So I don't know if that's really the case. I think it's just what appeals to the masses. And in the 1920s, there was a little questioning of the war already. Was it worth it? Should we have gone? And I think that really impacted mindsets into the 30s. And then all of a sudden, the Second World War happens, and that's kind of pushed, and I think, to the side. And I think maybe we're still living a little bit of that hangover of pushing it to the side.
Where would you, if you were starting today or someone brand new to that particular field of research, where would your first stops be for research materials?
Well, it sounds like I need to go to the library company and see all these posters.
Yes, you do.
Definitely, that should be your first
Yes,
stop.
because posters are emblematic of what the people are thinking at the time. And even if it is propagandistic in many ways, it's still part of this idea of what the people are thinking at the time. However, there are some great repositories for World War I documentation across the country. We have the fantastic World War I Museum in Kansas City. We have the Army Heritage and Education Center has some great primary sources there.
Carlisle,
Definitely,
Pennsylvania?
Yes, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Obviously, the Library of Congress and the National Archives have great holdings as well. And you can look for the local historical society for your local stories. If you want to go to the micro and you want to go down to what your ancestor did in the First World War, it's a great place to start. And I think we too often overlook them because we think of other entities, and that's our first stop and that's our first thought. But yet just across the street from us or down the block from us is a repository for these documents, because these are being donated in the 1920s and the 1930s. They weren't being donated perhaps to the Library of Congress. They were going down the street because someone has passed and their estate sent it to the local historical society. So I think that's a huge benefit for going to your local historical society, because sometimes it opens up a plethora of information you never would have experienced otherwise.
And I will jump in and just say, I definitely agree with John about looking locally, but I will say in all fairness, as much as I think the library company is where you should go to look at posters or look online, the Library of Congress has over 2,000 World War I posters digitized. Wow. So that is probably the best place to see as many as you possibly could in one place.
God bless the internet.
There you go.
Wow. Well, I think that's kind of encouraging. If you're an historian looking for a relatively unexplored area of American history, it sounds like World War I might be a good place to start. Well, we are going to put up those URLs that are recommended by John and Sarah so that you can start your research immediately online and search. So we're going to give you Library Company's exhibit and Villanova University's access. Thank you so much to my guests, John Heckman and Sarah Weatherwax, for a really thought-provoking adventure in a new area for me too. So we hope you'll be inspired to create from some of this amazing information and images that are available online. And we look forward to seeing you next time on Producer's Toolbox. Thanks for joining us.